So once I've had a look at my asset, given it a bit of time, being kind of critical of my own design, or I've shown it to my art director, or I've shown it to my lead or my client, then it's time to make the changes that they've asked for. After that, continue to start to add detail to the actual asset. So maybe sometimes this could happen through paint overs. I could do paint overs, they could do paint overs, and we can talk about sort of like what some of the elements will be in a faster fashion than modeling. And then we can really start to push it. So now what I'm going to do is I'll start kind of adding the actual detail to the asset to make it look really cool. But as I do it, I'll talk about my thought process during while I'm doing it. Not so much about the actual techniques. For that, you can refer to the small techniques videos that I'll include with the tutorial. But you can see those techniques being used throughout the process. And so this is more about talking about my actual thought process of the design. So at the moment, I'm thinking that this big shape in the front is a camera. So I want to look at cameras, think about how to make something just look like a camera that would be mounted on a drone in the near future, that would be used to kind of surveil people like you and me walking down the street. So I kind of want to make this look like it's a big front mounted camera. So the first thing I want to do is a nice big lens in the center. I was thinking a little bit Skynetty at first, and maybe it could kind of be an eye and it was sort of like lit red, or have some sort of nice LED kind of like material on it. But I think I'm actually going to keep it quite simple and just keep it looking like a lens, because it does look very much like a camera already when you add this nice big lens in the center. And then I'll probably add some slightly smaller lenses around it. So it's almost like the smaller lenses are used for kind of taking in telemetry data and things like that. And then this big high power lens is used for really kind of like zooming in and making sure that it can like identify us down to our irises at a mile away or something like that. So I want it to make it look like it's quite a heavy duty front mounted camera. And it's also sort of like the main element of the asset, which is why it's front and center. And I want to put a decent amount of love into it. So what I'm doing at the moment is thinking, how would this camera actually be maintained and accessed and generally be put together? So I'm putting these kind of elements in now, and I'm planning on Boolean subtracting them away from the actual asset in order to just make them look like they're points at which you'd be able to kind of unclip the front face of the camera structure. And this is something I do a lot in Modo, is just to use Booleans to extract these shapes once I'm kind of happy with them. I don't use Boolean union or kind of like adding shapes together very often, but to create these kind of holes, it's a lot faster to create a new cylinder, push that into a face and Boolean it away, rather than trying to model that shape into the front of a pre-existing shape. Especially as you can imagine trying to do it into a curved face, it just becomes an absolute nightmare. So that's where I try and avoid doing that kind of stuff. I'm also, you probably noticed, I didn't do any control loops or any kind of extra bevels around the edges of those holes, because that's where I'll use the round edge shader and I'll bake that in. So my high poly is basically a mid poly with a round edge shader, and then I'll bake all of that down to the low poly. So elements like my camera, my gun, maybe some of the smaller elements like parts that deflect energy away from the jet boosters and stuff, those will be baked. And the reason why I want to bake those is because I want them to have small details. So if my bevels are getting smaller than a couple of centimeters, then that's the point at which I want to bake this thing, because I want the player to be able to get really close, look at it, and it be able to stand up to you putting your player's hand on the actual piece. So if those bevels mean that they're only a few millimeters or sort of kind of below a centimeter or something, then I'll get that into a normal map and I'll use multiple UV sets. So One UV set, I'm planning on tiling all of my actual textures. So it'll just be tiling camouflage or tiling paint jobs or tiling metalwork. And that will tile all over the asset. And then the asset can use a second UV set to reference maybe a normal map that was baked uniquely for the components, or AO maps or masks that have been baked in order to help the material define where to be scratched and where to be rusty and where to be dirty. So now I'm thinking more about how do I make this camera look like it's a heavier duty camera than you would carry around on a tourist trip. So I'm thinking it needs clips and it needs access details and it needs sort of smaller telemetry cameras. So that's why I added kind of a clip on the top, because you can totally imagine someone connecting maybe some other type of modification or element to the front of this, if maybe it's in like hunter-killer mode or it's being used in a war zone as opposed to a domestic city. Then maybe they want to add attachments to the camera that will do other things like LiDAR, for example. So it's making sure that it's got those slightly militaristic attachment points that looks like this thing can always be added to or taken away from. And then I'm also continuing to just add these kind of 45-degree anti-radar shapes that I mentioned during the first blockout. So now I'm thinking, how does this camera actually move? So at the moment it looks like a static camera that is just facing in one direction. So I need to add some sort of framework that makes it look like this camera can pivot around and move within the framework. So if I'm a drone operator in a police station somewhere a couple of miles away and I want to pan the camera down, but I also still want this vehicle to be flying in a straight line, then this framework would allow for the actual camera to pivot around and move. And even if it's not something that the player thinks about too much, the fact that I've taken the time to think about how would this camera actually function and operate brings believability into the actual design work. And you can see that what I'm doing is I'm designing the elements and then seeing how nice they look with the round edge shader applied in my quick renders, and thinking, does that look like something that will actually render down to a really nice detail when it's actually finished? Or is it a waste of polygons, or is it adding unnecessary noise in areas where I don't want it? So I'm just going around and I'm kind of cleaning up the frame a little bit. Maybe I'll start to add detail that will never be in the low poly. But it's very easy for me to add these kind of mid-poly details, do some quick renders, see if it looks nice, and then when I come to creating the low poly for this thing, it's very, very easy because it's a mid-poly and not a high poly. So I'm only taking away some very small elements. So what I was doing just then is I'm assigning a new selection set to the pieces I've selected. Or in this case, actually, it looked like it was probably a new material. And that's so that I can change the size of the round edge shader. And when I bake it, the round edge shader would be on the camera, would be larger to make the bevels look bigger and make it look like a softer material. And then the round edge shader on the metallic pieces like the clip and the framework on the sides would have smaller bevels in order to make it look like a thin painted heavy metal element to the camera. So now you can see that I've just kind of fucked up the symmetry in the center here. So all I'm doing is, rather than sort of panicking and restarting it, I'll just slightly tidy up just one side, and then I'll delete the other side completely, resymmetry, and then I'm just good to go. Make sure the verts are merged together. And it was like I was saying in the previous video, it's more about just kind of owning the fact that every so often you will make these mistakes. If you spend 40 hours modeling something, you're not going to get all the way through the process without making mistakes. So rather than worrying too much about having to redo that part, just get used to kind of how you would clean it up, fix the symmetry, and then continue. That's generally a lot easier if you're using something like a modifier or something like that. So then what I'm doing here is kind of going through and tidying up the topology, because I'm thinking this camera doesn't really need to go much further. So now I can clean up the topology, think about how easy it would be to tidy this up into a low poly later, and then I can kind of forget about it. So the camera that I've built now is pretty much the final camera that I'll bake, because I don't need to now go in and add control loops and loads of small details, because small details could come from floating normals if I want to. So on the underside, all I'm doing is I need some sort of silhouette that says that this camera is actually connected to the vehicle on the frame. It doesn't need to be super detailed because it's only silhouette. It's only to make sure it doesn't look like there's this tiny floating camera on the front that doesn't do a lot. So at the moment, I'm looking at the camera and I'm thinking, I'm not quite sure about the front face of it. So I'm trying to add this detail in the middle just to bring a little bit more information. And even though I thought it's a really nice idea in my head, it kind of just looks like this weird little soul patch on the camera. So you can see that for the next sort of few minutes or 10 minutes, I'm kind of modeling away on this thing thinking, no, I'm going to make this work. I'm definitely going to bring in an asset here and it's going to look really cool and it's going to show that maybe we can connect something else. And yeah, maybe at some point I show it to a coworker or I show it to my lead and they're just like, no, this soul patch is pretty weird. It's not working. So I'm just kind of continuing to refine the shape, keep it simple. This is something is relatively simple because of the round edge shader. And at some point I'm kind of thinking, okay, maybe this is starting to work now. I've pulled it back. It looks like it's just an extra element that could connect other pieces to, or maybe it's a rail that the camera moves around on. Now I'm deleted just unneeded faces because I'm kind of thinking about what the low poly would need. And then that's it. So I'm kind of happy with that element on the bottom now. Stopped it looking like a soul patch and started making it look like it's a functional piece of the camera. So I'm sort of just continuing to refine my shape. So I'm planning on the actual camera at the front being baked, and this dark large element that I have selected at the moment will just be mid poly. So I won't bake any normal up to this because it's pointless me wasting any kind of like expensive textures such as pulling in like a unique normal to something that's going to be tucked away underneath the vehicle. I would rather model out a basic shape, do my kind of like small bevels, force the normals on it, tile the UVs across it, add the materials, and then that's finished. That's enough for me. So now I'm thinking, what if I could add some sort of element of like, this is how we maybe plug cables into the camera to unload its information, or it could just be some sort of access point, or maybe it's a down-facing camera. So I'm kind of really trying to make this work, but as you can see when I render it's really kind of conflicting with the silhouette in that space. So now I'm kind of trying to change it and maybe thinking this could be some sort of tank or battery. But again, when I render it and I look at it, I really feel like it's just kind of conflicting with the overall silhouette in the space. So what it's doing is it's adding extra interest underneath, but it's also taking away from the panel work that I spent time on around the gun. So by not having that strong silhouette on the panels that are sticking down on that corner, then I'm kind of starting to lose some of the storytelling that's happening in my design, which is why that element that I was just messing with is just gone, because the idea is nice, but it doesn't mean that it always works. So now I'm kind of just refining the shape of how does the actual afterburner on the back really connect into this drone. Remember at this point that I'm thinking, I honestly have no idea what I'm doing. I don't really know how this could connect. So I'm going on Google, looking at sort of maybe how it could just be kind of a sunken in element that's kind of hanging and could maybe pivot. So then I'm thinking, okay, I could just create basically a hole for it. And then maybe that would just then, it would be kind of a 3 or a 4 meter long shaft or jet that's kind of sunken right into the vehicle and we're only seeing the end of it. So that's why I'm kind of thinking, let's make it look a little bit like another vent. and then the vent is to house the actual jet, and then any heat that's building up around the jet can then kind of naturally be exhausted through the vent around it. So I'm just kind of going through and refining like all of these connection points. How do the actual elements work? For example, if I have this big shape that's sticking out underneath the vehicle that's making a lot of silhouette, at some point I need to explain why it's there. I can't just have a very large shape sticking out of the vehicle in order to give it a nice silhouette, but also not explain why it would be there from a very basic kind of engineering standpoint. So it must need some sort of panel, or maybe it would need landing gear connected to it or something like that. So I'm just also continuing to go through and refine the very basic underlying sections. So this is kind of like the foundation, I'll call it. So I'm just sort of refining the foundation that's sitting under the bodywork. And then I've just added a very basic light at the back to kind of help to pinpoint the actual afterburner. So that as I start to refine the design of the afterburner and how it's kind of embedded into the vehicle, then we can really see that the details are being picked up, and that's why I've kind of added that extra little bit of light. So I'm doing the exact same process as I did with the Blockout and with refining the Blockout. It's just kind of going through, adding the shapes, seeing if I like them, seeing if I miss my soul patch or not, doing my renders, and then kind of saying, okay, yeah, now I can continue this. So one thing that's really bugging me at the moment when I look at it is how clean it is between the actual kind of little thrusters on the side and the vents. So I'll probably start to add something there. I just turned that antenna back on from the very start of the design, and although I still feel like it doesn't look cool, I still feel like there's something missing in that area. So I'm trying to kind of add the antenna and then say, maybe how could this attach to the front of the vehicle? Because I do feel like there's something needed above the actual camera. So maybe I'll go back to that in a minute. But basically at some point I will say, okay, the antenna's obviously not working, so I need to just try and bring in some sort of detail there. So now I'm kind of just messing with my overall kind of colors and how it renders in order to help kind of separate the individual pieces. So remember that like when you create noise or interest in your design, it doesn't necessarily need to be with more modeling detail. It could be with decals, color, just general contrast. And contrast doesn't need to come from contrast in your modeling. So the kind of the main things I tend to use are if I want white panels and then I want dark kind of hardware, then that's me using contrast to help to build a composition in the vehicle. Then on top of that, an extra kind of like tool I have is that I'm already saying I want areas of interest to be using this hardware material, and then areas of like rest will be using the kind of surface paint job of the vehicle, which is white at the moment. And then my extra tool is that then I can go into the hardware and I can start to add additional modeling detail like I'm doing now. So I can really say, okay, these elements, I need to push these because these are functional elements. They're not built to look beautiful. They're built to have a purpose. So this piece I'm working on right now would be used to sort of like deflect the power away. But as maybe the power starts to fluctuate out of the engine, then these things could potentially move with it in order to just help to kind of like funnel the energy in a certain direction. So these would be kind of like able to pivot from their base, and they would just help to kind of like temper the energy as it comes out of the jet. So what I'm doing is I'm just duplicating this all the way around, and this is an element I've seen on designs like Paul Pepera's sci-fi kind of like spaceship work, and also in real designs. And I'm just continuing to add extra fidelity to the jet, because when you look at a real jet, this is something where there is lots of just general information happening. And that's because, again, remember that I want the player to look at the back and be drawn to the fact that this thing has light inside it, which is pulling my eye pretty quickly. Then it's also got a noticeable increase in detail, which is automatically drawing my eye because it's a contrast point. And then on top of that, it's using the hardware material, which is different to the areas of rest. So I'm using multiple kind of points to try and pull the player's eye in. And at least for a second, they'll look at this element, process that hopefully that's an afterburner. This vehicle looks like it can go fast. Then maybe they move on to the boosters on the bottom. So the boosters on the bottom, the way they're designed, just won't look quite as fast, and they also look like they can pivot. So then hopefully the player will look at those and think, okay, those things, they look like they can pivot round. They look a bit more like a jet on a commercial airliner as opposed to an afterburner on a fast jet. And so those are used to kind of maneuver the vehicle. And then the camera, again, it's just these kind of like bringing in extra areas of interest for the player or for the viewer. So now what I'm doing is I want to add these kind of like steel rods that are based around the engine or the jet, because I want it to look like at any point this thing is still built in elements. So you can kind of take the top off, or you can access the sides, and maybe these steel pillars are kind of used to help with the actual structural integrity of this area, because maybe the design needs to be sunken in here in order to allow for access for panels, or in order to allow for air to move around this area. Or in this case, what I'm going to do is add it kind of looks a little bit like an air brake, but I'm thinking a flap that can basically pull up and pull down, or maybe it's a flap that can come down in order to access some of the work underneath. So I'm thinking that these shapes will eventually be there just for structure. But again, I'm not just coming up with these shapes on the fly. I'm looking at lots of reference, and I'm seeing these shapes in some of David Lesperance's work, for example, or real kind of like SpaceX jet engines. And I'm just continuing to keep kind of building up this level of detail, whilst at the same time trying to think about not overloading the player, but just making sure I'm building a composition. So even within this jet engine, you can see that there are big areas of rest around the mouth of the engine, and then inside the engine there's lots of noise. And that's because I want you to look at the end of the jet, but make sure you're looking into the center of it and not just looking at the kind of like face of it and thinking, okay, I get it. I want you to be really kind of like looking into the gubbins of it and sort of thinking, okay, this is something that is processing lots of power and fuel and turning it into speed. And then this is where I start to kind of create the kind of air brake panel that I was talking about. And I'm thinking this is basically a reflection of the sort of like little dispersion brakes that I added around the mouth of the actual jet. So it could be that maybe as the vehicle tips down quickly, you can imagine that the airflow is coming up around the back of the vehicle and flat across the jet, or across the underside of this jet engine. So then maybe this flap would be able to pivot hard down, and as the air comes up around the underside of the jet, it would actually hit this like air brake and help to just give it that extra sort of like friction or resistance that it would need in order to pivot down in a fast fashion. And then when the vehicle moves up quickly, then it could potentially just do the same thing, where it's like the actual boosters on the side would rotate into a direction that they can just power up. Because remember, when the whole vehicle dips down, it's got gravity on its side. So using air brakes to sort of like funnel the air downwards, and then use gravity to help kind of get it to terminal velocity and drop the vehicle. would kind of help with the overall sort of like aesthetic, but also with the kind of like these elements, even though someone may never think about as much as I'm thinking about them now, they help to just build and build and build until eventually you see kind of something that if you feel it's got a sense of sort of design and thought that's gone into it, even if you don't need to understand exactly what the thought process was, then it really helps to kind of make sure that there's just that element of believability that I think is needed to make most kind of like realistic art like this work. So I'm thinking at this point is I want to go with this kind of like generic sci-fi triangle shape that I'm going to repeat all the way around the vehicle, and then I'm going to Boolean subtract it, or repeat all the way around the booster, and then I'm going to Boolean subtract them. And I'm hoping that it just adds a level of detail that looks quite nice, just to help kind of like make it look like it's a structural element. So it's like CNC machined to make this point of the engine look quite strong. But once I actually do it in practice, I felt that it looked quite kind of Aztec. It looks a bit like these weird triangular sort of like cave painting shapes all the way around the outside. So I kind of continue to keep adjusting the design and trying to make it work. But again, just as with the goatee, this is just not something that I can kind of commit to, because it's just, in thought it's quite nice, but then when I actually do it in practice, it's just adding too much. And I think one of the biggest problems with it is it's adding too much information in an area that I don't want the player to kind of settle on for too long. So what I can do is by building up all of this information is I can accidentally build up too much contrast and too much interest in a place where I'm kind of like not wanting them to settle. So yeah, that's kind of why I deleted that. So I'm thinking I have like areas of low detail, then I have areas of kind of mid detail and areas of high detail. So the areas of high detail would be like the jet engine at the back, because I think that's super cool, so I want it to be something to focus on. The gun will be relatively high detail because I do want you to kind of say, okay, I need to look at the gun. The camera. So the camera, even though it's not a crazy amount of modeling, it's still going to have decals on it that might say access panels here, or please look after the photovoltaic lens, or whatever. And those are extra elements of fidelity that help to draw the eye in. So remember, it's not all just about what you model in. Maybe sometimes I'm thinking this space where I just added this weird Aztec-y triangles, maybe this space doesn't need these. I can just get rid of these in the modeling work, and at some point I can add decal work here and just have warning labels or elements like that. So just keep thinking about all the tools you have. Tools being like normal decals, decals as in like stickers and warning labels, or extra color. If you obviously have only one bright blue area on the vehicle, it's going to stand out as an area of interest. And then just generally contrast in general, like if 70% of the vehicle is dark and then 30% of it is light, then obviously you're going to be drawn to the 30% that is light because you're creating contrast. So what I'm doing now is I'm going into my boosters and I'm just adding those single bevels that I will be doing all over the bodywork for the whole vehicle, because these elements, all of these white elements, will be not baked into the components at all. They'll just be using tiling textures with sort of no like individual normal maps. So I just want to go through and I want to figure out how big do I need the actual bevel to be, and then saying, okay, I need to then soften those, run my force normal script, and then basically that's how I leave it. But the problem with this kind of shape is when you're modeling this kind of shape into the face of a curved asset, it's very easy to get normal errors. So that's why I'm spending more time here trying to really kind of see how much extra information I need in the modeling, and also keep adjusting the actual normals until it kind of looks correct, because I don't want shading errors. And I'm doing the same here. I'm just adding that kind of like that small bevel, forcing the normals, seeing how it looks in the render. Because in the render already you can see that those bevels look like they could quite easily be a turbo smoothed part of the asset, or like a 3-sided bevel as opposed to a 1-sided bevel. And then in UE4 it will look pretty believable. It will look pretty close to a high poly asset. So this is the kind of like slow process of going through and adding these bevels and kind of experimenting with them. It's a slower process on a piece like this because it is curved. So that's kind of why I wanted to tackle it early, because sometimes I like to just take on the harder pieces early on so that I don't put them off, and then they don't slow down my overall productivity because I'm putting off the scariest pieces. So at this point I'm thinking I still kind of need to take in air around the front of the vehicle, because I want to cool the mechanics that are powering the gun, the mechanics that are powering the kind of rotation of the gun, and also the mechanics that are kind of like powering the movement of the actual camera. So I'm thinking it doesn't need to be a huge air vent because it's not cooling this huge afterburner on the back. It's more about just pulling in air around this section just to help to keep the air flowing around the inside of the vehicle here, and then that can get funneled out because it still won't be super hot by the time it's run over these elements. So then that can continue backwards into the vehicle to help to cool the actual kind of like power generation and the afterburners. So that's why I'm thinking, okay, I'm just going to keep experimenting with this sort of like new kind of panel shape. So as you can see, maybe this was feedback from an art director or feedback from just a friend of mine who doesn't even do 3D, but maybe they just think, okay, this area looks really boring or whatever. So basically my thought process was that these front corner panels, they just looked a little bit too boring and a little bit sort of too uninteresting. So what I want to do is, like, when you're seeing the drone from the front, your eye is being drawn to the area around the camera and the gun. So if I can add even more sort of like mid level detail to this area, then it's drawing me in. Because as you can see, it's not exactly high fidelity. It's not like I'm adding like 1mm or 1 centimeter details and clips and connections and stuff like that. I'm just thinking this is like a 1 meter long, 50 centimeter tall vent that's just a mid detail that's going to help to build up the interest in this area in general. So I'm just modeling this into this panel now. And then all I would need to do is, once I'm sort of happy with this is modeled into the panel, it's integrated in, is then I would take the edges, do those single-sided bevels like I was showing just now. And then that's that part of the process basically done. So you can see that really helps in the render to just draw the eye to the area. And also one thing I'm going to do in general is add bolts and rivets all the way around the panels, so that you can see that an engineer could come along, undo all of the bolts around the panel, and then take the entire panel off in order to access the underworkings of whatever's being protected there. So the actual information that's needed on the panel is not high. It just needs to be the basic shape of the panel, and then once I'm ready, the kind of single-sided bevels that I'm going to add, and then I'll use my force normals or face-weighted normal scripts to make those look cool. And this is basically my whole process: is add those elements, start to add the bevels, figure out whether I need that kind of like mid-poly or sort of like middle kind of detail level that will help to just kind of bring the eye in and help to kind of create contrast, because I don't want the whole asset to be quite basic, lots of areas of rest, and then the only levels of detail to be super high around the gun. I also want something in the middle to kind of like generally spread the kind of love and believability around on the asset. So I still feel that when I look at that face, I'm going to need a little bit of decal work there, some extra kind of like floating details on normals, just to kind of draw your eye down to the camera and the gun. So I'll probably do like very small kind of like vent holes that will just, maybe they look like they're used to just vent out a certain element that's quite hot on the side of the camera. And this, I'm thinking, is another one of those kind of like militaristic clips. So this is just an element that I'm modeling in. It'll be very, very basic, but the whole point of it is to look like potentially this thing is a plug-in point for something that just isn't connected to the vehicle right now. Or maybe it could be that there's in the area that houses this vehicle when it's not being used, this is a connection point that plugs into some robotic arms that hold the vehicle. Or maybe there's kind of like, maybe it doesn't have its own landing. Maybe it doesn't have its own landing gear, but actually comes in and lands inside a frame. So this could be the connection point that the frame connects to in order to hold the vehicle. So it's just adding these very small details that look like they could have some sort of use that is extra to the general sort of like design of the vehicle. And it's just, the main point of it is to add those sort of mid-tier details that I was talking about. And then the kind of like secondary point of it is to hopefully tell a little bit more story, even if it's not anything specific. It could just be that the player sees an element that is dark and contrasting from the area around it, wonders for a second what that could be. They don't necessarily need to know, and then they think, okay, fair enough, and then they move on. Because when I look at an attack helicopter, for example, I don't necessarily know what every kind of like connection point and every hinge and every detail on the surface of it is. But what I have learned is that when I look at attack helicopters or tanks or planes, there's loads of these sort of small elements that I don't understand. So what I want to do in my design is make sure that I have these kind of small elements that don't necessarily tell a story right away, but they help to kind of say, okay, these are obviously being used for something. I might not necessarily understand it, but it helps to give me the believability that this could be used in a sort of like by the military. In this case, I'm kind of thinking that this actual vehicle is being used by a private contractor, which is OTEC Industries, and OTEC is obviously has designed and built this vehicle, and then maybe the police have a contract with them, and so OTEC use this vehicle, and it flies around the city, kind of surveilling the whole city. And when something happens, maybe a call comes into the police department, and OTEC employees in the police department would then send word or control the drone directly, and then use the drone to kind of like either go and get reconnaissance, or using the gun could potentially kind of like actually do something about the situation. But I'm also thinking by adding these small clips and stuff, you could very easily imagine that this vehicle could have kind of like jungle camo or desert camo if it's used quite low to the ground, or maybe it could be quite light grey if it's typically in the air and you don't really want it to be seen, like they would use it in Afghanistan. Or in these areas, I'm just going in and I'm adding small bevels, seeing how they work with the force normals, and then I see that it's just a waste of polygons because it's not giving me enough, so then I delete it. So those edges, I'll just leave those like as a single edge, and I'll leave them hard, because the only way I would feel sad when I look at them is if I got really right up against the vehicle, and even then I don't think I personally as a gamer would care if those faces were just hard edges. So I'm only really beveling the areas that feel like they need it because I don't want to waste poly count. So to me, it's not like I'm not thinking about a poly count specifically, especially because I'm used to using Snowdrop, which can handle a lot of polygons. I'm thinking more about not being wasteful. So as long as I'm building in a way where I'm not being wasteful with the actual design, then I'm happy. And then if later on a tech artist comes to me and says that this is just too high poly, then we can go into the mid-poly modeling and start to figure out how we could just start reducing the bevels or start reducing the overall complexity of the mid-poly modeling. And because of the whole process, it's very easy to re-UV it and re-UV and reapply the materials within minutes instead of needing to start the entire process of rebaking a high poly to a low poly again. So it's that kind of iterative fashion of this style of modeling that I'm kind of like leaning on during my whole process from start to end. And quite often what we could do is we could say we don't want to reduce the poly count, but maybe the mesh memory is too high. We're calling in just so many polys that the actual amount of megabytes or kilobytes that this thing is using is too high. So what I could say is the right hand side of the gun will be the original, and maybe we instance the left hand side of the gun, and it just means that we have to have mirroring. So that's like, we don't always need to necessarily lower the poly count. We could just start to instance parts in order to tackle some of those issues. So here I'm just adding detail into the gun. I'm thinking the actual projectiles or the actual kind of like energy maybe that this thing fires comes from these big boxy shapes on the sides. Or maybe they kind of like use small cameras in the front or kind of lasers or something like that in the front of these boxes to really kind of define the trajectory of where the projectile is going to go, or maybe read distance or telemetry or something like that. And then maybe the actual projectile comes from the center of the gun. So we just need to build in this kind of like elements of real kind of like life guns that we have now into the vehicle. So which is why I'm adding kind of like panels underneath that move around and elements like that. So I'm looking at heavy mounted guns on vehicles, not a gun that a person would hold. And now I'm thinking that this whole thing would obviously need power in order to move. So I'm thinking the power kind of comes around this cable from the back into the back of the vehicle. And then that, as the whole thing pivots, then the cable is able to flex with it. And maybe it is an energy weapon. So maybe it doesn't need ammunition at all. Maybe it's just, it takes telemetry from these small details that I think I'll model into the sides of the gun. And then the actual projectile or the actual kind of damage is just coming from electricity or whatever kind of power we're generating through the whole vehicle. So now I'm starting to think about, how do I show some silhouette that kind of tells the story that there is some sort of power generation under here, but it also needs to be just kind of protected and is just kind of like hidden away from the outside of the vehicle, because it is like temperature controlled and maybe it's more delicate than the rest of the vehicle. So I'm thinking these kind of look a little bit like ribs, but they're sort of like, their job is to take the brunt of any kind of hit to that side of the vehicle. So if you were to imagine that a projectile hit this vehicle, and it would hit these plates, and hopefully they would take the damage that came in, so it wouldn't hit the power generation. But also when the maybe if the vehicle crashes, it lands on its side, and then these kind of like boosters on the sides, they crash into the side of the vehicle, and you don't want those to kind of breach the side of the vehicle and actually get to the power generation and potentially cause an explosion or irreparable damage. So it's kind of keeping the whole thing quite modular. Maybe this thing could crash, lose 2 of its jump jets, have those replaced. But the kind of core of the vehicle, like the power generation and the actual afterburner, you really wouldn't want to damage, because that's kind of the very core of the vehicle needs replacing and isn't overly modular. So I'm thinking, like, I do want it to be very basic. I don't want it to draw the eye like crazy, but I just want it to be slightly different to the rest of the bodywork, so it looks like the bodywork is formed around this shape. And because it's quite basic, it also means that I can just mid-poly model that shape, give it small bevels and force those. And then that would be the kind of like the total complexity of the modeling there, because I wouldn't want to... It's not worth the texture space, so the expense of starting to bake it. And I also don't need the detail to be so high that I would need to bake it, because I don't want the player to spend too much time focusing on this point. For example, like if I wanted to expose the engine of a car, and I was going to do it on the side here, like expose this huge underlying engine, then I would need to know that it would need to have a lot of detail, and I want to really kind of make that a focal point of the vehicle. But then that would kind of generally break the composition of my vehicle, because I want the composition to be that the vehicle looks long and thin and agile. So I want you to be looking at the front of the vehicle, and then I want you to be looking at the like where the power comes from, and then maybe the maneuverability. I wouldn't want you to be looking at the very center of the vehicle and thinking, oh, okay, this is more about how this vehicle generates power, and drawing your eye to the middle of it, and then that takes away from the general composition of the whole thing. So it's more of the mid-tier detail that I mentioned before. So I'm just kind of like tidying my modeling up a bit, seeing where maybe I have a face that is a large n-gon at the moment, and thinking, okay, I need to make sure that this isn't curved. It does need to be quite flat in order to create those kind of 45-degree angles that we spoke about to deflect radar. And then I'm just kind of going through and continuing the process of slowly increasing the amount of polygons and detail and information as I go through the design, as I get closer and closer to kind of like wrapping it up. So for example, I think the modeling on the side of the boosters is probably already finished, because all I need to do is UV that and tile materials across it, because it's just panel work. And then the only extra detail that will come for that is decals and normal decals like bolts and just vents and stuff like that. So although they'll look like they have more information going on in the final renders, pretty much like some elements are already finished in the design as far as like for a game. So now I'm starting to think about how do I want to show that there is some sort of like big element under here. So this is very similar to what I was doing above the camera. I'm trying to think about how can I potentially add a big shape that will change silhouette here. And then if I can get it to work on like a medium level, like does it start to look interesting? Then I can say, okay, from here I can start to really increase the detail. So I'm thinking this looks a little bit like exhaust or drivetrain, or maybe it's some sort of modular battery or something that maybe the boosters pivot from. But the moment when I look at it, all it's doing now is, if you look at this render, is pulling my eye into the middle of the vehicle too much. So I'm starting to think that I'm not looking at the front. I'm starting to overthink this center area. So I need to get rid of that. I need to simplify it. And if I do have any interest or extra information happening in towards the center of the vehicle, then I want it to be either related to the speed of the vehicle, so the afterburner, or I want it to be related to the maneuverability of the vehicle, so it needs to be something to do with the boosters on the sides, or it needs to be connected in some way to the gun and camera, which is the main point of the vehicle. So I've removed that detail on the side, and then all of this modeling that's happening now is in order to support the airflow that looks like it helps to cool the general power generation and afterburner of the vehicle. So I'm just generally kind of fleshing this out and saying, okay, how would these pieces connect to each other? How would they connect to each other in a way that's simple enough that the poly count is low, but also does enough to tell the story? Because I don't want the poly count to be so low that it's just uninteresting to look at. So this is all about modeling the housing for the vents that would sit around the afterburner, but also the kind of housing for the afterburner itself. And it's really kind of tidying it up so that I know that the only stages left for those areas are to go in, add those single-sided bevels, do the force normals, which is very fast, UV it and apply materials, and then I'm done. So I'm still like really trying to make this detail on the side work. But spoilers, I will delete it because it just doesn't work. So I'm continuing to kind of leave it there. But as I mentioned towards the start of the tutorial series, I sometimes, if I'm not convinced by something, I'll just leave it alone for an hour or two and then think about it again, because then it's sort of like having a fresh idea. So as I mentioned already, I have this big bulky shape on the underside of the vehicle, but I also need to explain why it's there. My main priority is that it's there for silhouette. Like I need it to look kind of big and chunky at the front, so it looks like there's power, and then it's getting more and more slender towards the back of the vehicle in order to help it look like it's there for aerodynamics, because I'm trying to replicate the shape of like an attack helicopter. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, why are these shapes here? I really need to kind of like help to define what they're actually doing. So in this case here, the area I'm adjusting now eventually will be a vent. So it looks like it pulls in air around the sides of the afterburner. So at this point, I really need to stop and think about how I'm going to set up my decals in order so that I don't start to increase noise too much through modeling and just imagining where the decals will be. I want to get them in relatively early so that I can really kind of consider them as an element to my design. So that's what I'll go and do now.